At the very heart of Immanuel Wallerstein's extensive work, The Modern World System I, lies a profound and unsettling question. What if the most common way of understanding our modern world, as a collection of distinct, sovereign nation-states, each charting its own unique historical course, is fundamentally flawed? The entire book is constructed as an answer to this challenge. It puts forward a powerful, alternative argument that to grasp the true dynamics of modern history, from its very beginnings to the present day, one cannot treat individual societies or nations as self-contained units of analysis. The analytical lens must be pulled back, widened to encompass a much larger, more integrated entity, which is termed the world system. This first volume of the larger project is not a theoretical treatise in the abstract. It is a meticulous work of historical sociology. It is dedicated to reconstructing, in dense detail, the specific historical origins of this modern world system. The analysis traces its emergence during a period Wallerstein calls the long 16th century, an era stretching from roughly 1450 to 1640. This period is identified as the crucial crucible in which the foundational structures of a new type of social system were forged, a capitalist world economy. This was a system unlike any that had come before it, and one that would, over the subsequent centuries, expand to engulf the entire globe, setting the terms for the next 500 years of human history. The book's central thesis is that the pivotal events of this era, which are often studied in isolation, were in fact deeply interconnected parts of a single coherent process. The terminal crisis of European feudalism, the so-called Age of Exploration and the conquest of the Americas, the rise of powerful centralized states in Western Europe, the vast inflation of the price revolution, and even the Protestant Reformation, all of these were not separate parallel histories. Instead, they are presented as interlocking moments in the difficult and often violent birth of one singular, overarching system with a logic and a structure all its own.
This explainer will follow the argumentative structure laid out with great care in the book itself. The analysis begins where the book begins, with the fundamental methodological problem that drives the entire inquiry: the search for the proper unit of analysis for the study of large-scale social change. It is this initial choice that shapes all subsequent findings. From this methodological starting point, the focus shifts to the historical context, specifically the medieval prelude to the modern era. This section examines the deep structural crisis of the feudal system in the 14th and 15th centuries. This crisis did not automatically produce capitalism, but it did shatter the old order, thereby creating the necessary preconditions for a new kind of system to emerge. The analysis then proceeds to trace the actual construction of this new European world economy. It identifies and explains the three essential pillars that had to be put in place for this system to function: geographical expansion, the development of variegated modes of labor control, and the creation of strong state machineries in particular locations. Following this, the explainer dissects the system's spatial and hierarchical structure. This involves a detailed look at its geography, distinguishing between the distinct roles and characteristics of the core, the periphery, and the semi-periphery. Understanding this tripartite structure is key to understanding the system's operation. The system's logic is then observed in action through an examination of the major political struggles of the 16th century. This section focuses on the conflict between two possible political frameworks, a world empire versus a multi-state world economy, and explains why the victory of the latter was essential for the future of capitalism. Finally, the analysis concludes with a theoretical reprise. This section steps back from the historical detail to summarize and clarify the core concepts, such as unequal exchange and the distinction between the periphery and the external arena, that constitute the lasting theoretical framework of world systems analysis.
Every form of scholarly inquiry, no matter the subject, must begin with a foundational decision about the object of its study. It must define its universe. For much of its history, modern social science, whether in history, sociology, or political science, operated with an implicit and largely unexamined assumption. This assumption was that the natural and proper container for social life, the primary unit of analysis, was the nation-state, or more vaguely, a society, which was understood to be more or less coterminous with the political boundaries of a particular state. The entire intellectual project of the modern world system begins by directly confronting and challenging this foundational premise. The argument is that this default setting, this habit of viewing the world as a mosaic of independent societies, was not just a minor inconvenience, but a profound source of error. It was leading to incomplete and often entirely incorrect conclusions about the nature of social change and the real mechanisms driving the modern world. The book's very existence stems from a recognition that this long-held paradigm had begun to break down, that it was no longer capable of explaining the phenomena it was meant to interpret. The old model, which saw nations as masters of their own destiny developing along internal paths, was proving insufficient. A new model was required, one that began from a different starting point altogether. This critique leads directly to the pivotal question that opens the entire analysis. What is the proper unit of analysis? If one wants to understand the immense historical transformations that have shaped the modern world, the origins and development of capitalism, the formation of state structures, the creation and evolution of social classes like the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, where should the analytical boundaries be drawn? What is the box within which these processes actually occur? Is it the individual state, as was traditionally assumed? Is it a particular cultural zone, a civilization, or is it something else entirely? This choice of unit is not a mere technical or preliminary step. It is the most consequential decision an analyst can make. It fundamentally shapes every question that is asked and every conclusion that is reached. If the nation-state is chosen as the unit, then the causes of change will primarily be sought within that state's borders, in its internal politics, its class struggles, its unique culture. The book's central claim, however, is that for the modern era, which is to say the last 500 years, this conventional choice is not just an incomplete framework, it is a fundamentally misleading one, because the most powerful determinants of social change have not been located within states, but within the larger system in which those states are embedded. This intellectual break with the state-centric model was not born from abstract philosophical speculation. It grew directly from the author's empirical research on the contemporary world, specifically on the nations of Africa in the mid-20th century. In the period following decolonization, the prevailing theories of development had assumed that these newly independent nations would, or could, follow the same historical path of modernization that had been blazed by the countries of Western Europe and North America. They were seen as new actors, now free to begin their own national stories. However, a close study of their political and economic trajectories revealed a starkly different reality. A critical realization emerged. The developmental paths of these new states were not, in fact, truly their own to choose. The range of options available to their governments and their peoples was severely and systematically constrained by powerful forces operating on a global scale. Their legal sovereignty was undeniable, a matter of international law and recognition, but their practical reality was one of constant pressure from a larger, pre-existing world economic system. They were actors on a stage, to be sure, but the stage itself was not of their making. The rules of the game, the distribution of resources, and the very structure of the play were being determined by the logic of a system that was far older and more powerful than they were. This empirical anomaly, the gap between the theory of sovereign development and the reality of constrained choices, forced a search for a new unit of analysis, one large enough to contain not just the individual actors, but the entire stage upon which they acted.
In order to conceptualize this new, larger unit of analysis, the book proposes the specific, technical concept of a social system. This term is used with precision. A social system is not just any random collection of individuals or groups. It is defined as a comprehensive entity with a number of key characteristics. First, it has boundaries. These boundaries are real and discernible, but they are not necessarily the formal political borders of a state. They are the effective boundaries of an ongoing integrated social process. Second, it has structures. These are the enduring patterns of relationships, economic, political, and social, that give the system its shape and stability over long periods of time. Third, it is composed of member groups. These groups may have different cultures, speak different languages, and belong to different political units, but their lives and fortunes are fundamentally intertwined by their shared participation in the system. Fourth, it has rules of legitimation. These are the sets of beliefs and norms that justify the system's structure and its inequalities, giving it a degree of political and cultural coherence. Finally, its internal life is not one of static harmony, but of conflicting forces. The system is held together in a state of dynamic tension, constantly reproducing itself through the interplay of contradictory pressures. A social system, in short, is a kind of self-contained universe. Its development is governed primarily by its own internal logic and contradictions, not by forces external to it.
The argument then makes a decisive and powerful move. It asserts that if this rigorous definition of a self-contained social system is applied to the sweep of human history, one finds that only two types of entities have ever truly met the criteria. On one hand, there have been very small, isolated, subsistence-level economies. These hunter-gatherer bands or simple agricultural villages were genuinely self-contained, but they were also politically and economically simple, and they do not account for the major historical transformations of civilization. When considering large-scale, complex societies, the argument is that the only social systems that have ever truly existed are what the book calls worlds. These are not necessarily global in the sense of covering the entire planet, at least not initially, but they are worlds unto themselves. Their single most important defining feature is that they are large, self-contained zones held together by an extensive and integrated division of labor. This means they are vast networks of production and exchange, where different regions perform different economic functions, but all are interdependent and operate as a single functioning whole. According to this framework, these worlds are the true arenas where the grand drama of modern history unfolds. They are the only unit of analysis large enough and coherent enough to study the origins and development of modern social structures.
Before the New World System could be born, the old one had to break down. The dominant social system in medieval Europe was feudalism. Its eventual collapse, primarily during the 14th and 15th centuries, was not a simple, single event, nor was it the result of a single cause. It was a general, systemic crisis, what might be called a perfect storm of converging, long-term pressures that brought the entire mode of production to a point of terminal decline. This breakdown was profound. It created a situation where radical transformation became not just one possibility among many, but an existential necessity for the continent's ruling classes, the seigneurial lords, who saw their power and wealth evaporating.
The crisis of feudalism is best understood as a conjuncture of three distinct but overlapping phenomena that reinforced one another. The first was a long-term structural process of secular stagnation. By around the year 1300, the feudal mode of production in Europe had effectively reached its limits. The available agricultural technology was stagnant, and the long process of clearing forests and draining swamps to create new arable land had come to an end. There was no more fertile land to easily bring under cultivation. As a result, the system of seigneurial revenues, the complex web of rents, dues, and labor services that formed the economic basis of the landowning nobility, was stretched to its absolute breaking point. The lords were trying to extract more surplus from a system that simply had no more to give. Second, a catastrophic cyclical downturn struck this already fragile system. The Black Death, which began its devastating sweep across Europe around 1350, caused a demographic collapse of unprecedented scale. With a third or more of the population wiped out, the continent experienced massive and persistent labor shortages. This dramatically shifted the balance of bargaining power away from the lord and toward the surviving peasantry. Lords were forced to compete for scarce labor, leading to rising wages and falling rents, further undermining their economic position. Finally, a climatological shift compounded these existing problems. The period from about 1300 to 1450 marks the beginning of the Little Ice Age, a time of cooler average temperatures and shorter, less reliable growing seasons. This led to reduced crop yields and an increased frequency of devastating famines, putting even more pressure on the system's ability to produce a surplus. The cumulative effect of these three pressures was the unraveling of the old order. For the ruling class, the traditional feudal methods of extracting wealth from the land and its cultivators were simply no longer sustainable. They faced a profound crisis of their revenues and their very survival as a class. A new, more efficient, and more reliable system of surplus appropriation had to be found.
Faced with this systemic breakdown, two primary paths for reorganizing society on a large scale were historically available. The first, and by far the more common solution throughout world history, was the creation of a world empire. A world empire is a vast political structure, like that of ancient Rome or imperial China, which uses a single overarching state apparatus to politically dominate an entire division of labor. In this model, economic surplus is appropriated directly by the state through mechanisms of tribute and taxation. This wealth is then collected and redistributed by a massive centralized state bureaucracy. While this model can be very effective at creating political stability and order, it tends to become economically stagnant over time. The bureaucracy itself becomes immensely costly, consuming much of the surplus it extracts, and its political imperatives often stifle private economic innovation and commerce. The second and much rarer path was the creation of a world economy. This, too, is a large geographic zone with an extensive and integrated division of labor. The crucial difference is that it is not bound together by a single political structure. Instead, it contains within its boundaries a multiplicity of different and competing political units, states, empires, principalities, and city-states. In this system, surplus is appropriated not primarily through direct tribute to a central state, but through the indirect and ultimately more efficient mechanisms of the market. This structure allows for the possibility of what is key to capitalism, the endless accumulation of capital. Historically, world economies had been unstable formations, tending either to break apart or to be conquered and converted into world empires. The unique path taken by Europe after 1450 was to create the first durable capitalist world economy.
This raises a central question. Why did Europe take this unique and consequential path, and not, for instance, a technologically and culturally advanced civilization like China? The book argues that Europe's crucial and paradoxical advantage was its relative political failure. At that historical moment, China was a vast, sophisticated, and politically unified world empire. Its unified political structure, however, ultimately acted as a brake on economic enterprise. A single imperial bureaucracy governed by a political logic could make decisions that would halt overseas exploration, redirect economic activity, or tax nascent industries out of existence, subordinating commercial logic to the needs of the state. In stark contrast, Europe around 1450 was a chaotic patchwork of competing and warring states, principalities, and independent cities. This political fragmentation, this lack of a single overarching political authority, was the secret ingredient for its economic success. No single political entity could control the entire economic arena of the nascent world economy. This gave economic entrepreneurs, merchants, financiers, and capitalist producers an unprecedented freedom to maneuver. They could play states against one another, shift their capital to whichever location offered the most favorable conditions, and generally operate in a system where economic logic could often take precedence over the political logic of any single ruler. Europe's political disunity, often seen as a weakness, was its accidental genius. Capitalism could emerge and thrive in the institutional cracks between states, in a transnational space where no single king or emperor had the power to crush it. The world economy was larger than any one kingdom, and that fact made all the difference for the future.
The new capitalist world economy that began to crystallize in the wake of feudalism's decline was built upon a new and far more extensive division of labor than had ever existed before. This was not a natural or accidental process that simply unfolded on its own. It required the active construction of a set of foundational pillars, three essential and interlocking developments that, taken together, established the fundamental framework of this new system.
This new system was actively constructed upon three essential pillars. First was a dramatic expansion of the geographical size of the European world. This was most obviously accomplished through the great voyages of exploration that led to the conquest of the Americas and the establishment of sea routes around Africa to Asia. This expansion brought vast new territories, resources, and populations into the system's orbit, vastly increasing its scale. Second was the development of what is called variegated methods of labor control. This is an absolutely critical point. The system did not impose a single, uniform type of labor across its entire expanse. Instead, different methods were developed and applied to different geographical zones of the world economy. These methods were tailored to the production of specific products and the specific role that each zone played within the overall division of labor. The system thus included a wide spectrum of labor relations, ranging from legally free wage labor and tenancy in some areas to various forms of coerced cash crop labor like the second serfdom in others to chattel slavery in still others. The third pillar was the creation of relatively strong, centralized state machineries. Crucially, however, these strong states did not emerge everywhere. They were created primarily in the core areas of the system. These states were not passive observers of economic life. They were essential tools for shaping the market, creating the conditions for profit, and securing the economic advantages of their own national bourgeoisies on the world stage.
The geographical expansion of the 16th century was not driven by a simple spirit of adventure. It was driven by the urgent needs that had arisen from the crisis of the feudal system. First, Europe required new and much larger sources of bullion, gold and silver. This was necessary to provide a stable monetary base for an increasingly commercialized economy and to settle persistent trade deficits, particularly with Asia. The old European mines were depleted, and a new supply was essential. Second, the system required new sources of staples, especially food and fuel. Growing populations and increasing urbanization in parts of Western Europe were outstripping the productive capacity of the local agricultural system, a system which, as noted, had already reached its structural limits. This expansion, initially spearheaded by Portugal and later dominated by Spain, was therefore not merely about discovery. It was a process of systematically incorporating new territories into a single integrated economic division of labor. The Americas were rapidly transformed into a source of bullion, with vast silver mines in places like Potosi, and a producer of agricultural commodities like sugar, which were grown on plantations. At the same time, parts of West Africa were pulled into the system, not primarily for their own products, but to supply the slave labor required to operate those American mines and plantations. This vast intercontinental network of trade became the circulatory system of the New World economy, pumping resources and wealth from the newly incorporated lands towards its emerging heartland in northwestern Europe.
A key economic feature of this era of expansion was a long-term secular inflation that has come to be known as the price revolution. For a period of roughly 150 years, from about 1500 to 1650, the general price level across Europe rose steadily and significantly.
While this inflation was certainly fueled in part by the massive influx of silver and gold from the American mines, which increased the money supply, the book argues that its more fundamental significance was as a powerful and hidden mechanism for capital accumulation. It functioned by creating a significant time lag between the rise in prices and the rise in costs. The prices of finished goods, especially agricultural commodities, rose relatively quickly. However, wages and land rents, which were often governed by custom or long-term contracts, tended to rise much more slowly. This growing gap between prices and costs represented a massive, silent, and society-wide transfer of wealth. It systematically shifted surplus away from two key groups. The first were the members of the traditional landowning aristocracy, who lived off fixed or slowly changing rents and found their real income steadily eroding. The second were the wage earners, whose real wages fell as the price of bread and other necessities rose faster than their pay. The primary beneficiaries of this process were the entrepreneurs, the capitalist farmers who could sell their produce at high prices while their rents and labor costs lagged behind, the merchants who profited from rising commodity prices, and the early industrial producers. In effect, the price revolution was a foundational process of primitive accumulation, creating the initial pool of capital for a nascent capitalist class at the expense of other social groups.
The new European division of labor that was constructed during the long 16th century was not organized on a flat or egalitarian basis. It was, from its very inception, profoundly and intentionally hierarchical. As the system took shape, it developed a distinct geographical structure, organized into three interdependent and relationally defined zones: the core, the periphery, and the semi-periphery. A state's or a region's position within this tripartite structure became the primary determinant of its specific economic role, its internal class structure, and the relative strength or weakness of its political machinery. To understand the world economy is to understand this spatial hierarchy.
At the apex of this newly formed hierarchy was the core. Geographically, this zone crystallized in northwestern Europe, with England, the newly independent Dutch Republic, and parts of northern France as its primary exemplars. The core specialized in the most profitable economic activities, those requiring higher levels of skill and greater concentrations of capital. This included advanced agricultural techniques like enclosure and crop rotation, a growing variety of craft and early industrial manufacturing in sectors like textiles and shipbuilding, and, crucially, control over the most lucrative aspects of international commerce, such as shipping, finance, and insurance. The predominant form of labor control that emerged in the core was legally free labor, primarily wage work and various forms of tenancy. This form of labor was most suitable for the more complex and skilled tasks required in core production, as it offered greater flexibility than feudal or coerced labor. Politically, the states in the core developed strong, centralized, and efficient governments. These state machineries were not passive referees. They were active and partisan players in the world economy. They used their power through mercantilist policies, strong navies, and favorable legal systems to create and protect monopolies, dominate trade routes, and rig the global game in favor of their own merchants, manufacturers, and financiers.
At the very bottom of the system's hierarchy was the periphery. In the 16th century, this zone comprised two main regions: Eastern Europe, particularly Poland and Hungary, and the newly conquered territories of Hispanic America. The designated economic role of the periphery was to produce low-wage, low-skill bulk goods for export to the core. To serve this function, its production became highly specialized, often devolving into a dangerous dependency on monoculture. Eastern Europe was reorganized to become the breadbasket for the core, exporting massive quantities of grain and timber. The Americas were structured to export silver from their mines and sugar from their plantations. To produce these goods as cheaply as possible, the labor forms employed in the periphery were explicitly and brutally coercive. In Eastern Europe, this took the form of the so-called second serfdom, a new and more intensive system of manorialism that tied peasants to large estates producing for the world market. In the Americas, it involved various forms of forced labor, including the encomienda and mita systems, and later, large-scale chattel slavery. Politically, the states in the periphery were either non-existent, as in the case of colonies, or were deliberately kept weak and pliable. Their local governments, where they existed, were co-opted or dominated by outside forces, compelled to serve the economic demands of the distant core rather than the developmental needs of their own populations. Their political weakness was not an accident, it was a necessary condition for their economic exploitation.
Positioned between these two poles of the core and the periphery was the semi-periphery. This was an intermediate zone with a mixed economy, possessing some characteristics of the core and some of the periphery. One can think of the semi-periphery as the system's middle manager, or perhaps more accurately, a zone in transition. In the 16th century, this zone was largely composed of the old developed areas of southern Europe that had been the economic heartland of the previous feudal era. particularly Spain, Portugal, and the Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa. These regions were experiencing a process of relative decline and deindustrialization compared to the dynamic, rising core in the Northwest. The semi-periphery found itself in a difficult position. It was simultaneously squeezed and exploited by the core above it, losing out in the most advanced and profitable sectors of the economy. At the same time, it also participated in the exploitation of the periphery below it, acting as an intermediary in trade and finance. A common form of labor control found here was sharecropping, a system that sits midway between the free wage labor of the core and the coerced cash crop labor of the periphery. Politically, its state structures were stronger than those in the periphery, but they were generally less efficient, more bloated, and less effective at promoting capitalist interests than the lean, powerful states of the core.
This comparative view makes clear how this three-tiered structure was not a collection of separate worlds, but a single, integrated, and functioning system. The hierarchy was not an accidental outcome, it was the machine's design. The core's diversified, high-skill, and relatively high-wage production was only economically viable because it could rely upon a steady and cheap supply of raw materials and foodstuffs produced through low-wage, coerced labor in the periphery. The semi-periphery played a crucial role as both a political and economic buffer between the two poles, absorbing political pressures and facilitating trade. This axial division of labor, with its carefully matched set of labor forms and state structures, created a structural flow of economic surplus. This flow, which the theory terms unequal exchange, consistently moved value from the periphery to the core. This process is the central mechanism that not only establishes but also deepens and reproduces the hierarchical relationship between the zones over the long term, leading to development in the core and what would later be called underdevelopment in the periphery.
This point is absolutely crucial for understanding the entire argument. The coercive labor systems that emerged in the periphery during this period, such as the second serfdom imposed on peasants in Poland or the encomienda system that subjugated indigenous populations in Peru, were not a simple revival of medieval feudalism. They might appear similar on the surface, involving unfree labor tied to the land, but their underlying economic function was entirely and fundamentally different. Feudal serfdom was part of a system of production primarily for local use and consumption, within a largely autarkic manorial economy. Its logic was one of subsistence and the maintenance of a traditional social order. In stark contrast, what the book terms coerced cash crop labor was a thoroughly modern invention. It was a form of labor control created specifically for the purpose of producing commodities for sale on the capitalist world market. The Polish lord, who intensified obligations on his peasants to produce a grain surplus for export to Amsterdam, was not acting as a feudal patriarch. He was acting as a capitalist producer, responding to market signals and seeking profit in a global marketplace. The Spanish encomendero, forcing laborers to extract silver for export, was likewise an integral part of this new capitalist system. From this perspective, the entire world economy, including its most unfree parts, was capitalist because its single unifying organizing principle was production for profit on a world scale. The different labor systems were not separate modes of production. They were two sides of the same capitalist coin. One side was polished and legally free in the core, while the other was brutal and legally unfree in the periphery, but both were minted by the same global logic of endless capital accumulation. The establishment of this new capitalist world economy was not merely an economic or a social process, it was intensely political. The 16th century was defined by a fundamental struggle over the political superstructure that would govern this new system. This struggle pitted the logic of a world empire, a single state dominating the entire economic zone, against the logic of a multi-state world economy, what is here termed statism. The outcome of this conflict would determine the political shape of the modern world.
Throughout the first half of the 16th century, one political power came tantalizingly close to unifying Europe and transforming the burgeoning world economy into a true world empire. This was the Habsburg dynasty, particularly under the rule of Emperor Charles V. His dominion was immense, stretching from Spain and its vast American possessions to the Netherlands, large parts of Germany and Austria, and sections of Italy. Had he succeeded in consolidating this power and defeating his rivals, the political history of the West would have been entirely different. However, this grand imperial project ultimately failed. It collapsed under the weight of its own ambitions. It was militarily overextended, fighting constant, draining wars against its primary rivals, France and the Ottoman Empire. And it was torn apart internally by immense fiscal strains and the deep political and social divisions unleashed by the Protestant Reformation in Germany. According to the book's argument, the failure of the Habsburg imperial bid was the single most important political event of the century for the future of capitalism. A world empire, with its massive, top-heavy, and expensive bureaucracy designed for tribute collection, is fundamentally incompatible with the primary logic of capitalism, which is the endless accumulation of capital. An empire prioritizes political stability and revenue extraction over economic efficiency and growth. The collapse of the Habsburg dream ensured that Europe would remain politically fragmented, a collection of competing states.
The defeat of this imperial option was not a setback for the new capitalist system, it was its salvation. By ensuring that Europe would remain a patchwork of multiple, competing states all operating within a single, overarching economic zone, it preserved the crucial political space for capitalism to grow and mature. In such a system, capitalists had a freedom of maneuver they would never have had under a single imperial roof. They could play states against each other, shift their investments to find the most favorable political and tax environments, and escape the potentially crushing tax burden that a single, bloated imperial bureaucracy would have inevitably imposed to fund its military and administrative costs. The constant competition between states, a defining feature of the multi-state system, created a dynamic that rewarded economic efficiency, technological innovation, and capital accumulation, a dynamic that a unified empire would have almost certainly smothered under the weight of its own political and administrative logic.
Within this multi-state system, however, political power was far from evenly distributed. The states in the core grew stronger precisely because a strong state apparatus was an essential tool for capitalist development. These strong core states acted as powerful engines for their national bourgeoisie in several key ways. Internally, they worked to homogenize the national market, breaking down the remnants of feudalism like local tolls and internal trade barriers to create a single, unified economic space where goods and capital could move freely. Externally, they used their political and military power to secure decisive advantages in the world market. This was the era of mercantilism, where states used aggressive policies like high tariffs, navigation acts that mandated the use of their own ships, and the creation of colonial monopolies to benefit their own merchants at the expense of rivals. The state also provided a direct source of capital accumulation through its fiscal policies. Taxation could be used to fund infrastructure and to provide loans and contracts to favored capitalists. And finally, the military power of the core state was used to establish and maintain political and economic domination over the periphery. Navies and armies were essential for enforcing the unequal terms of trade, protecting shipping lanes, and putting down any resistance to the economic order that benefited the core.
The history of England in this period provides a classic example of this process of parallel state building and class formation within a core nation. The famous historical debate over the rise of the gentry highlights the emergence of a new and powerful class of landowners in the English countryside. These were not old-school feudal lords who lived off customary dues and were oriented toward local consumption. They were a new breed, commercially minded, capitalist farmers. They were enclosing common lands to create more efficient pastures for sheep, investing in agricultural improvements to increase crop yields, and producing wool and grain not for local use but for sale on the national and international markets. This rising rural bourgeoisie became the key social base and political ally for the powerful, centralizing Tudor state. Their economic interests in commercial expansion, the protection of private property, and the creation of a stable, unified national market aligned perfectly with the state's own drive for increased power and tax revenue. This symbiotic alliance between a dynamic capitalist class and a strong state machinery was the hallmark of a core power. It was this combination that enabled England to eventually surpass its rivals and establish itself at the very center of the world economy.
This final section provides an opportunity for a systematic review of the core theoretical concepts that have been developed and used throughout the historical narrative. This reprise serves to crystallize the abstract framework that underpins the entire analysis. It clarifies the key distinctions and defines the central mechanisms that together constitute the concept of the world system, moving from the specific historical details back to the general theoretical model.
This slide highlights an absolutely critical theoretical distinction: the difference between a region that is peripheral to the world economy and a region that is in the external arena. It is not enough for Europe to simply trade with another part of the world for that region to become part of the system. A peripheral area is defined by its fundamental integration into the system's axial division of labor. This means it exports low-wage bulk goods like grain, timber, sugar, or cotton, which are essential to the daily functioning and, most importantly, the capital accumulation processes of the core. This deep economic integration leads to a process of unequal exchange, and crucially, it fundamentally transforms the periphery's entire social, political, and economic structure to serve its specialized role within the system. The external arena, by contrast, lies outside this integrated division of labor. Trade with the external arena does occur, but it consists mainly of what are called rich trades, the exchange of high-value luxury goods like silks, spices, or precious gems. This kind of trade can be very profitable for the merchants involved, but it is not structurally essential to the reproduction of the system as a whole. Because it is a trade in preciosities rather than necessities, it does not lead to the fundamental alteration of the social organization of the external arena. In the 16th century, Poland was clearly part of the periphery. Its entire economy and class structure were being reshaped to facilitate the export of grain. Russia, on the other hand, was still in the external arena. It traded furs and other luxuries with Europe, but its internal social structure remained largely separate from and unaffected by the logic of the European world economy.
This leads to the engine that drives the entire hierarchical system, the process of unequal exchange. This is the central ongoing mechanism that maintains and reproduces the hierarchy between core and periphery. Because the core specializes in higher wage, higher capital, and often quasi-monopolized forms of production, while the periphery is forced into low-wage, highly competitive production of raw materials, the terms of trade between them are structurally and permanently skewed. In effect, the products exported by the periphery embody a greater total amount of labor input than the products exported by the core for which they are exchanged. This imbalance results in a constant, systematic, and large-scale transfer of surplus value from the periphery to the core. This is not simply a matter of one side being better at bargaining or gaining a temporary market advantage in a single transaction. It is a structural outcome of the worldwide division of labor itself, a process that is created and backed by the differential power of strong core states and weak peripheral states. It is this continuous, hidden transfer of wealth through unequal exchange that allows the core to accumulate capital at an accelerated rate while simultaneously creating and deepening the conditions of dependency and so-called underdevelopment in the periphery.
To summarize the defining features of this new social system born in the long 16th century, first, the modern world system is and always has been a capitalist world economy. Its primary unrelenting logic, the law that governs its motion, is the endless accumulation of capital. Crucially, it is not a world empire. Its unique dynamism depends on the persistence of a multi-state political structure, which prevents any single political logic from suffocating the economic drive. Second, it is characterized by this unique and paradoxical combination: a single integrated division of labor that spans the entire system, creating deep economic interdependence, but multiple competing political systems within it. Third, its structure is inherently and necessarily hierarchical. The system is structurally dependent on the relational division between core, periphery, and semi-periphery. This hierarchy is not an incidental feature. It is the basis of the accumulation process. And this leads to the ultimate methodological takeaway. No part of this system can be understood in isolation. The wealth and development of the core, the poverty and dependency of the periphery, the political actions of a single state, the formation of a particular social class, all of these phenomena must be analyzed in relation to their specific position and function within the world system as a whole.
The analysis, therefore, arrives at its final declarative statement, which is also its most fundamental premise. The system itself is the only valid unit of analysis. When one asks about the mode of production that characterizes the modern era, the answer must apply to the world economy in its entirety. It is, through and through, a capitalist system. This remains true even if many or even most of the workers within that system do not work for wages. Those seemingly non-capitalist forms of labor, like serfdom, sharecropping, or slavery, are in fact essential components of the overall capitalist system. They were created or radically transformed and maintained specifically to facilitate the process of capital accumulation on a world scale by providing cheap inputs for core producers. The relations of production that truly define the system are therefore the relations of production of the whole system, not of its individual parts. Free wage labor in the core is inextricably linked to and structurally dependent upon coerced labor in the periphery. They are functionally integrated parts of a single capitalist reality. This holistic perspective is the fundamental contribution of the world system's analysis.